Programs normally seen at this time will not be presented this afternoon in order that we might bring you the following CBS News special report. On Friday, March 14th, President Carter spoke to the nation on the economy and inflation.
Inflation is a symptom of economic distress. The truth is that we have inflation because our economy is not productive enough to do all the things that we demand of it. We want it to give us higher incomes, bigger profits, and bigger government programs in the areas where we have a special interest. The federal government must stop spending money we do not have and borrowing to make up the difference. Our whole society, the entire American family, must try harder than ever to live within its means.
There's no disagreement with Mr. Carter's goals. There is wide disagreement with the means he proposes to achieve them. This afternoon, we'll look at those opposing ideas.
This is a CBS News special report. Carter and the Economy, Other Views. Here is CBS News correspondent George Herman in Washington.
Good afternoon. It is CBS policy, after a presidential broadcast on controversial issues, to provide equal time for contrasting points of view. On March 14th, President Carter outlined to an audience in the White House and to the nation a 5-point program including reduced federal spending, credit controls, and wage and price restraints to combat double-digit inflation. This afternoon, we're going to hear from leaders of business, labor, and government who have the opposing ideas we spoke of. We have provided the cameras and given them this forum. We have not edited their comments. We hear first from Jerry Worf, International President of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees.
The President and Congress have proposed to fight inflation by eliminating the federal deficit. A balanced budget is the centerpiece of the political response to inflation. According to every reputable economist, balancing the federal budget will at best reduce a 20% inflation rate by 0.1%. The administration and its congressional supporters admit that balancing the budget won't control inflation, but the White House tells us a balanced budget will have a psychological impact on rising prices. Inflation won't be solved by amateur psychology. Inflation is a concrete reality that's creating hardship for tens of millions of low and moderate income Americans, including public workers. Budget balancing won't end these hardships. Far from it. The program cuts balancing the budget will mean crucial sacrifices from the people who depend on public service and the people who deliver them. Every American must sacrifice to fight inflation, including public employees. But the sacrifices must be even-handed. And to urge Americans to tighten their belts at the same time that corporate profits are jumping 20% after taxes is not a sound or moral program. The first necessary step is a national incomes policy that places mandatory control on every facet of American economic policy, not just wages. Profits, interest rates, dividends, all must be controlled with a very tight lid fixed on prices. These mandatory controls, seriously enforced across the board, are the only way to break the inflation spiral. And these controls must be accompanied by a redistribution of the tax burden. Over recent years, the corporate share of the tax burden has dropped steadily. The federal government has handed out one tax break after another to American business, all under the guise of promoting investment. President Carter campaigned 4 years ago on the slogan, "The American tax system is a disgrace to the human race." It's more disgraceful now than then. There is nothing inherently wrong with giving corporate incentives, but let's use them intelligently instead of handing corporations a blank check on their taxes. Let's reward those businesses that are responsible, but let's use taxes to penalize those corporate giants that boost consumer prices to maintain record profit margins. What it all comes down to is this: an anti-inflation program must be fair to all segments of our society. That's the only anti-inflation program that will work, and that's the anti-inflation program that public employees are ready to support.
William Simon is a financial consultant. He was Secretary of the Treasury under Richard Nixon.
The only thing more fraudulent than the new program to counteract inflation in this country is the president himself. But perhaps, as the trappers said back in the 19th century, that the American people were the only animal that they ever knew that could be skinned more than once. Now, President Carter, in examining the facts, has spoken very piously about inflation and balanced budgets for the past 3 years. But look what's happened. Spending has increased 40% in the first 3 fiscal years that he's been in office. This year it's going to increase in excess of 15%, with all the inflationary and financial dislocations that means. In this, his 4th anti-inflation program, the president timidly cuts $2 billion from spending in fiscal 1980. As 20% inflation, 20% interest rates rage in the country. And in reality, spending, because it's going up elsewhere, will increase $4 billion. In fiscal 81, the president says we're going to cut $13 billion. Big deal. Out of a budget that exceeds $600 billion. But in reality, if you look at the numbers, spending is only going to be reduced to $4 billion. But he says we're going to have a surplus. How does he do it? He does it through increased taxation on the American people, on the people who are already being crushed by the burden of additional taxation. Well, this hypocrisy has not escaped the financial markets, because the financial markets, they don't care about political rhetoric. They look at the reality of a program. And the bloodbath continues as interest rates continue to escalate. The stock market is at its lowest level in almost a year and a half. No, we have to look at reality instead. President Carter has ignored the need for the balance between fiscal and monetary policy. He has left the entire job to the Federal Reserve System, and the Federal Reserve System cannot do it alone. Our massive deficits have been the driving force, forcing the Federal Reserve System to be the engine of inflation. He has in effect declared a national credit police state, where the wise men in the Federal Reserve System will decide who in the American society is worthy of credit. No, I'm sorry, only courageous political action, attacking inflation, productivity, through fiscal, monetary, tax, and regulatory actions will avert the financial and economic crisis that we're on in the present course. But I despair of it occurring under this administration.
Howard Baker of Tennessee is the minority leader of the Senate. He recently withdrew as a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination.
There's a danger, I think, that the American people may begin to believe that inflation is inevitable and a permanent way of life. But I don't believe that. And I would point out that in the last year of the administration of President Ford, that inflation was running at less than 5%. And now, 3 years into the Carter administration, it's almost 20%. And in real terms, this enormous increase in inflation has meant that the price of bread has doubled in those 3 years. The price of gasoline has doubled. The price of a car has gone up on the average about $2,500. And the price of a home has gone up about $25,000, making it almost impossible for the average American to even consider building or buying a new home. The cost of a loan has gone up from 7% to goodness knows where it'll end. It's now around 20%. And President Carter can, and he often does, blame everyone but himself for these terrible increases in the cost of living. He blames OPEC. But oil price increases, even when absorbed in the cost of other commodities, account for only about a quarter of the present rate of 20% inflation. He blames worldwide inflation, but our inflation rate is 3 times higher than Japan's, West Germany's, or France's inflation. He blames the American people for spending too much and borrowing too much. But the American citizen, on the average, handles his or her credit better than the federal government handles its credit. The federal government next year will try to balance its budget, I hope and trust, and Republicans will help with that. But President Carter proposes to increase the burden of taxation on the American people by $100 billion next year. And that will be the biggest single increase in the tax take in this nation in our history. It's time to balance the budget, but it's time to reduce the burden of taxation. And the way to do that is not just with the Republican president and vice president, but with the Republican Congress as well. That's the way the American people can get what they must have.
Representative Henry Royce is a Democrat from Wisconsin. He's chairman of the House Banking, Finance, and Urban Affairs Committee.
Inflation, as I view it, is such a danger to this country that we can't afford to do less than take all the measures needed, and I regret to say we aren't now doing that. In my judgment, what we need is to erect a mighty fortress against inflation, and the prime fortification in that fortress would be structural reform. By that I mean that our automobile industry is not now making the subcompacts which save gas and which we need. We go to Japan and Germany for those. That's wrong. Our steel industry has not modernized, and we're losing that. And you can take industry after industry, from semiconductors to textiles, and you find the same sad story. So what we need as the main element in our fortress is structural reform, which means productivity, which means added competitiveness. And I would take a leaf from what Germany and Japan have done. They have formed in the last 20 years industry, labor, government teams to work out solutions for their specific structural sectors. I think we need to do the same thing, and the sooner we start, the better. Then that central fortress has to be surrounded by some other things. You need fiscal restraint, and here I think the balanced budget, which the President has called for, is absolutely essential, though it ought to be a budget that is balanced with recognition of human needs, and particularly with full preservation of jobs programs. You need monetary restraint, and there I support what the Federal Reserve is doing in general, but I'd like to see them give more emphasis on helping capital investment in housing and plant and equipment, because those two things, if we encourage them, will help fight inflation. On top of that, I think we really need gasoline rationing, which would guarantee every American the gasoline they need to get to and from work and for all agricultural and business and industrial purposes. That's so much better than trying to ration by price or rationing by aggravation, depending on how long you have to wait in a gasoline line. Having done all of those things, then I would advocate what I think is perhaps the least important, but it's still important, a 6 months price-wage freeze to get rid of our inflationary psychology. Put all those things together, and I think you've got a mighty fortress against inflation. Anything less won't work.
Senator Jacob Garn from Salt Lake City, Utah, is a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee and the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs.
I agree with the President's attempt to balance the budget. However, a balanced budget in and of itself is simply not sufficient. And I do not believe that the President will be able to accomplish a balanced budget with a $13 billion reduction in expenditure. I think he's doing it with mirrors. I think he's manipulating statistics and giving the impression that we will have a balanced budget with a very modest cut in expenditures. And of course, the proof of the pudding will not occur until after the November election, so he really can't be held accountable. I do believe that the American people should know that there is no expenditure cut, really. There is only a reduction in the increase. We're having a massive budget increase this year to $615 billion. The President is talking about cutting only $13 billion. I would suggest that we must cut at least $30 billion out of expenditures this year to have any real impact on inflation at all. It would even be more important if we went to the neighborhood of $50 billion. Now, in addition to large expenditure cuts, we must look at another area that was not even mentioned by the President in his remarks, and that is regulation. It is estimated that the cost of regulation on the American people is $100 billion per year. This does have a massive effect on inflation, on consumer prices, and certainly an area that must be attacked by removing government from the marketplace, freeing up the productive capacity of this country. And speaking of production, we must also increase productivity. We must recognize that a 15% pay increase is not inflationary if we produce 15% more. But a 2% wage increase is inflationary if we have a reduction in productivity. This was another area that was only lightly touched on by the President. So we must have a three-pronged attack. We must balance the budget and reduce expenditures. But we must also do something about the massive interference in the private sector of regulation. And then we must do everything we can to increase productivity. Campaign year rhetoric and talking about balancing the federal budget will not do it. I suggest that the President and this administration, the Democrats, have the courage to really address the problem, to let the American people know that we must have large expenditure cuts, that we cannot do it with mirrors and election year campaign rhetoric.
William M. Agee, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Bendix Corporation, spoke to us in Southfield, Michigan.
Mr. Carter is once again attempting to solve our economic crisis. I cannot question his diagnosis. Inflation is the #1 problem facing this country. It is draining the nation's vitality. Inflation is the cruelest and most regressive tax of all. We must cut it back radically. But Mr. Carter's solution to this problem is a big disappointment to me. He suggests that discipline and sacrifice are necessary and then fails to set the example. We are asked to believe that there's discipline in federal budget cuts that amount to only 2% of an already swollen budget, a budget that has risen by almost $200 billion in the past 3 years. We are asked to believe that a federal budget balanced for 1 year is a strong blow against inflation. We are asked to believe that the bulk of the improvements in the federal budget can wait until fiscal 81, well after the November elections. Well, I don't believe, and I cannot accept Mr. Carter's economic package as the right prescription. He has failed to attack any of the root causes of inflation. Instead of proposing powerful incentives to stimulate savings and investment, he is offering more taxes and higher interest rates. Instead of cracking down on waste in government, he is shifting attention to the consumer, who can apparently afford to cut back more easily. Instead of making immediate, deep cuts in spending, he is excusing the majority of federal programs as uncontrollable. So without drastic reductions in government spending and without necessary incentives, Mr. Carter must stress discipline and sacrifice. But where is it going to come from? The burden rests with you and me, the taxpayers, who will continue to watch more of our paycheck go to fund government programs. We must remember that this is the same man who campaigned 4 years ago with a promise to reduce inflation, balance the budget, and cut back on the federal bureaucracy. The facts are that inflation has tripled since 1976. The budget is still in the red, and the federal government continues to be out of control. But we are still asked to believe. What we need is for the President and the Congress to move swiftly with broad, clearly defined programs to regain our economic health. Unless we do this right now, we will not see an end to high inflation rates without a serious recession. What's worse, we could have the recession without dramatically reducing inflation. This program must include vigorous discipline at virtually all levels of government, reduction in the growth of entitlement programs, and adoption of positive incentive programs which will encourage savings, investment, and productivity. These are the kind of policies that we need, yet the President's message ducked every one of them. He continues to tinker at the margin of our real problems. He is trying to shift the burden of sacrifice and discipline while still making them politically painless. This just cannot be done. It is harsh to say that an American president has failed in leadership and vision, but it must be said. This country has a lot of life in it and a lot of potential. A time of crisis can also be a time of opportunity. We know what must be done. The question is our courage and our will to do it.
Milton Friedman is an economist with the Hoover Institute at Stanford University.
President Carter's so-called anti-inflation program is primarily a public relations gesture designed to satisfy the public rather than a serious attack on our real economic problem. That real economic problem has two faces: rapidly rising inflation on the one side and declining productivity on the other. For a fundamental attack on those problems, what we need to do is drastically cut government spending, eliminate government regulations, and continue with a program of monetary restraint. The president is talking about cutting government spending, but that's mostly talk. If you look at the size of the cuts he proposes, he's sending an infant to do an adult's job. He proposes cuts of $13 to $14 billion in the budget for 1981. That budget, as President Carter projected it in January of this year, would show a $51 billion increase over the projections for 1980. What he is proposing to do, at best, is to cut projected increase in spending from $51 billion to $38 billion. There would still be a $38 billion increase in spending. Moreover, to judge from past experience, the actual increase in spending is likely to be considerably higher than the projected increase. What we need are budget cuts of the order of $60 to $100 billion rather than budget cuts or cuts in rises in budgets of $13 billion. The president also talks about balancing the budget. Our real problem is not to balance the budget. The easiest way to balance the budget would be to have still more inflation, because inflation raises the taxes that you pay more rapidly than it raises government spending. President Carter proposes to balance the budget entirely by higher taxes. Taxes that have already been imposed, such as the forthcoming rise in Social Security taxes, the excise tax on oil that has been called a windfall profits tax, and other measures already on the books. In addition, he proposes additional taxes on gasoline and in other ways. The net effect would be a rise in the tax load on the American people of something like $50 to $75 billion over the next year. President Carter talks about reducing regulations, but in fact what he proposes is a still further burden of regulation. He proposes credit controls, which are a very inefficient and undesirable device for reducing spending by consumers and by business. He proposes further regulations in the field of energy. The greatest harm of all, which is likely to be done by this cosmetic program proposed by President Carter, is that it will mislead the American people in terms of what needs to be done. Inflation rates in the first several months of this year were extraordinarily high, approaching 20%. That's what triggered this program. Regardless of what the government does over coming months, those inflation rates will be coming down. They are accidents, aberrations. The fundamental underlying inflation rate is lower. The great harm is that President Carter's program will be given credit for, and he will undoubtedly take credit for, that reduction in inflation rates which is coming anyway. And that may induce us to avoid facing our real problem.
Catherine Eickhoff is Executive Vice President of the Townsend Greenspan Economic Consulting Firm.
President Carter's latest anti-inflation program largely ignores the source of our problem and recommends measures which will increase inflation in the next several months and do little to reduce it longer term. Inflation is not caused by consumer spending, by high oil prices, by wage demands, or big business. Inflation is caused by an excessive expansion of money and credit for which government policy is largely responsible. This nation's very political freedoms are now threatened by this inflation. We can no longer afford to allow the government to pretend they do not know the source of the problem nor have the means to correct it. They do. Look, President Ford submitted the first budget for 1980 to Congress with projected outlays of $483 billion. President Carter did not believe that inflation was a major issue, and he added $50 billion in new programs to projected 1980 outlays. By January of this year, inflation clearly was a problem, consumer prices rising 18%. But government outlays were not cut back. Instead, they were increased another $30 billion. In the 6 weeks of pulling his new program together, a further $5 billion has been added to the estimate of what the government will spend this year. That $85 billion increase in outlays for 1980 is a typical example of the process by which government policy promotes inflation. The proposed $2 billion cut in expenditures is too little, too late. Although direct government spending is the most obvious way in which government policy promotes inflation, it is only the tip of the iceberg. However, what can we do? First, the American people must let their congressmen know that they will be held responsible for the failure to control government policy and reduce inflation. We must stop lobbying to protect programs from cutbacks, which we personally favor. The concept of uncontrollable expenditures must be eliminated once and for all. Ultimately, we'll probably need a constitutional amendment to limit government spending, but in the meantime, a two-thirds vote of both houses of Congress should be required to pass any appropriations bill. As we restrain spending, however, we must also correct the damage which inflation has caused. We must reduce taxes so that the tax structure no longer provides a free ride to government at expense of the individual taxpayer. We must provide tax incentives to business for capital investment to improve productivity and reduce future inflation. We must remove all price, wage, and credit controls from the economy. In short, we must shift from policies of expediencies to ones of accepting short-term costs in order to achieve long-range benefits.
Those were 8 opposing views on the president's latest anti-inflation program. Mr. Wirf, speaking for those employed by the government, says don't cut the budget at all, impose mandatory controls on wages and prices, and put heavier taxes on corporations. Mr. Simon and Mr. Agee, representing business, say the president's budget cuts are too small to accomplish anything. They urge that taxes on business and savings be reduced to encourage the building of new factories and machinery to increase our productivity and thus our affluence. Senators Baker and Garn, both Republicans, say Democratic policy is to blame for inflation, and one sure way to cure it would be to elect Republicans who'll really cut the budget. Our opposing Democrat, Chairman Henry Royce of the House Banking Committee, wants attention focused on structural policy, cooperation between management and labor, modernization of basic industries like steel and autos. Our 2 economists, Milton Friedman and Catherine Eichhoff, say the president is on the right track, but isn't traveling far enough or fast enough. In short, the opponents say he's doing too much or too little, has not found the right mixture of ingredients, and the prescription simply won't work. I'm George Herman, CBS News.
This has been a special report from CBS News. Carter and the Economy, Other Views. This is CBS.
Come to Pathmark, the